Okay, welcome back to the Security Table podcast series. We are on episode one, part three, which is mitigating risks beyond audits. So in our overall series on the limitations of traditional audits, we're on the third section here. So the idea that we're going to dive into here is why audits should just be one layer in a robust, multi-layered security approach that absolutely requires proactive measures. And yeah, we're going to dive into some of the specifics of what proactive security really is, why it's a necessity, what it looks like, how you can integrate it, and hopefully you have some actionable takeaways that you can implement in your organization. So let's just start with a simple question, which is why is proactive security even a necessity? I'll give a couple of examples to start us off before we dive into some of the kind of technical details, but we can see that even some very simple proactive security testing methodologies or tools like static analysis continually catch issues missed by auditors. This is not to say that the auditors could not have caught those issues. It's a case of those things that we dove into in part one of this series, which is just audits are limited in many ways: human error, scope, time, understanding of the code base, blah, blah, blah. Maybe they're limited because you went into the audit wildly underprepared and they had to spend a ton of their time fixing little issues instead of focusing on kind of bigger, sophisticated vulnerabilities. Either way, whatever the reason, continually issues slip through the cracks that simple testing methodologies such as static analysis could have caught. We see that with a ton of we always run an exploit postmortem whenever there are hacks in the space. We're continually running our static analyzer and proving that we could have caught these vulnerabilities that were missed by auditors. So if that's not a good enough reason to just start thinking about proactive security, I don't know what is. That's a pretty simple one. But I do want to touch a little bit more on this audit readiness piece. So, okay, you love audits. You trust audits, you rely on audits. Why would you not want to set that audit up to be as successful as possible? More vulnerabilities left undiscovered throughout your development. So going into audits with tons of vulnerabilities still in the code means that audit is going to be less effective. By default, there is tons more to get through. The auditor likely will start with the low-hanging fruit. You don't want them to start with the low-hanging fruit because what's left beyond that? If you've cleared away the low-hanging fruit, you're increasing the effectiveness of that audit. But also, if you go in wildly underprepared again and you've got all these issues, that audit report is going to come back with a lot of issues. And I'm pretty sure you don't want to publish an audit report that shows that your code has a ton of issues. And so we see this chatting with VCs that we're partnered with, for instance, where they have a port code that comes back with an audit report that's full of vulnerabilities, and they say like, okay, great, go fix those, and now go get another audit because we're not publishing that first audit report. You're going to publish a second one that's cleaner. So there's double the spend that you're spending on these, single one-off external audits that, ideally could have been mitigated. That first audit could have been tackled by your internal tooling, and then you would have just gotten one external audit. And then there's the remediation cycle. So obviously, like, the more vulnerabilities that the auditor's finding in your code, the longer it's going to take for you guys to go back and forth on fixes and for you to implement the fixes and then make sure everything's clean and then deploy. That's lengthening, your project times. That's delaying your deployment, delaying your releases, your launches, whatever those things might be. And then back to my initial point, which is also just the more stuff you put on the auditor's plate, the more likely they are to miss something. So leverage proactive security tooling, clear as much as possible away ahead of time, and get more out of your audit and increase your security. But this is not a brand new novel concept. This is not something that we're coming up with in the context of, cybersecurity in Web3. This is all pretty tried and true, at least as kind of a philosophy or a culture. And Hani comes from a cybersecurity background. So Hani, talk us through some of the parallels that you see with kind of existing best practices from Web 2.
Yeah, so in Web 2, keep in mind the stakes are a lot lower. Data breach versus treasury drain. So just the ramifications of something going wrong are not as substantial. That being said, there's still far more robust methodologies and best practices in place. And there's a reason they're mandated, and they're mandated by regulatory usually. Like, these best practices come into place because regulatory says, I mean, that's how security's pushed just in general in the Web 2 ecosystem. But the problem is in Web 3, we're not regulated. We all know that, right? So how do best practices come into place? They come into place by thought leadership, by what VCs and the third parties kind of controlling these organizations deem appropriate and necessary. And so it actually becomes the responsibility more so than ever of the CEO, of the board member, to mandate and dictate that these best practices must be in place. And I will say the best teams we work with, and I mean best by like their security posture is the best. Like I would put my money in them tenfold. Of course, if I had a lot of money, which I don't, but invest in them tenfold because I know my funds would not be at risk. Because the way they think about security, they come from either a Web 2 background or they've been educated via a Web 2 background, like however that information transferred to them, but they don't take it lightly. They understand that those best practices were put in place for a reason and they apply it themselves. They say we must be testing everything robustly prior to audit. We must have internal security posture. We must also post audit have bounties in place. We must also post audit put on-chain monitoring and the event something goes wrong. So like before even deploying, everything is thought out to a T. And because of that, and I knock on wood, but like almost every team that we work with has either gotten to a place where they've adopted that thought process or came from a place where they always had that. And because of that, they've never been exploited. But the teams that get exploited, they think they can skip out on little things. And so the benefit again of operating in the Web 2 ecosystem is regulatory just mandates like you must do X, Y, Z, and everyone's just doing it because they have to. And thus they're in a pretty fortunate situation. And again, the stakes are a lot lower. But in our ecosystem, that's not the case. There isn't any best practices really being told except a third party audit, which we've just talked about, like incredible. However, not the only thing you need to succeed. And just a small piece of the puzzle. So having that culture of security and having it embedded from day one as part of the narrative you so clearly dictate to your team of like your code and the way you think and the way you build needs to be centered around security is critical to succeed in this ecosystem. Otherwise, it's just a matter of time before an exploit occurs.
Mhm. Anish, what do you think are some of the kind of critical testing methodologies that teams should be employing on the proactive side?
Good question. So, uh, you asked about testing. I'll answer more broadly about just pre-deployment tools that everyone should be using, because I want to start with static analysis. I think static analysis just should be a no-brainer for everyone to employ, both at the developer level and at their CI level. Uh, the reason I say that, one, in Web2, it's just everywhere, right? Like all the companies do it at the CI level. Often you cannot get your code merged if they have high static analysis vulnerabilities. The other part is it's really low lift. It takes less than a second to run. Often it's very easy to figure out whether it's a true positive or a false positive when it does point out something. So it would baffle me for it not to be included in the stack. Uh, and All right, so moving on from that, I the next part is unit testing. I think a 90% minimum branch coverage should just be mandated across the board. If regulatory does not get to that, I hope that companies get to it. Branch coverage is not everything. I think branch coverage is the first thing you do. So it just like Honey said, that audits mean that someone has looked at your code. Unit tests mean that you have thought about testing your code, and 90% branch coverage should just be the bare minimum for developers. Moving on, I think you should try and test your code in as many ways as possible. Uh, One example of this would be mutation testing. Uh, Mutation testing, unfortunately, is not that common right now in Web3, but it's very common in Web2, especially in critical software. For example, compilers. A lot of people do a lot of different kinds of mutation testing for compilers. In banks, they have a lot of mutation tests. And it's a very effective way of finding new kinds of vulnerabilities that and bugs that people have not even thought about. Uh, Let me explain what mutation testing is. So the main idea behind mutation testing is that you introduce small changes in your code base, and then for each change, you'll run your test suite before and after introducing the change. What we expect is that your test tree should detect this change happened in your code base, and ideally, this change should not be passed through to deployment. One example of this would be, suppose you have a super important function somewhere, and that's protected by the only on a modifier. right? So you essentially have access control limiting the access of this function only to the owner. I'll go in, I'll remove the only owner modifier, and then run your test suite. What your test suite should do at this point is should start failing and it should detect that that there's no access control on this function anymore. And this is what mutation testing tries to do systematically across all your contracts. So for essentially each line in your code, it will try and introduce one small mutant that should not happen, and that should be detectable by your test suite. And this can find a variety of really interesting vulnerabilities because no one, when a developer is writing code, right, they're never thinking about this. They, again, for example, this non-return case, or if you're using math somewhere, when you're writing a math operation somewhere, you don't think about if I switch this plus to a minus, what would happen? But often doing that and like seeing whether the test suite can detect changes tells a lot about the status of the test suite and the status of the code itself. So I think mutation testing is also a no-brainer to be included. The final piece I think is fuzz testing. uh a lot of vulnerabilities only show up when you're property based first testing. I really would like people to have any kind of fuzzing in their code bases, whether it be white box, black box, property based, etc. I think fuzzing can bring out really interesting problems, especially if you're using any sort of money, economics. A lot of complex cases get illuminated there.
Awesome. And how do you think teams should be integrating these into their sort of overall development or security lifecycle?
Sure. So I think they should be layered. I think developers should themselves be using these tools as well. So if you have developer facing tools, for example, if you have CLIs, if you have extensions, that's often a very good way as the first check. It's again super low lift. The developer can quickly run these tools before even pushing. And this again breeds into the security culture part of it, right? Like it makes the developer think about security before pushing their code but to any repository. The other thing is, I think you should have CI limitations. So, uh, I would really protect the main branch from any of these PRs without running these tools. So, what we have seen companies often do is they'll for example block on all high severity static analysis issues. Each engineer has to either dismiss or look at and fix all the high severity static analysis findings. You can and you should definitely have a minimum coverage threshold. You should not allow a release branch essentially without 90% unit coverage. And it's very easy to set this up in your CI, whether it be GitHub, GitLab, or any other places. Same thing for mutation testing. I would expect or I would recommend at least 90 to 95% mutation coverage as well after unit testing on the same CI pipeline.